You can learn any language at any age. It gets more difficult, of course, if you try to learn a language at 80 if you've never done it, but human brains are wired and equipped to learn any foreign language, provided that they do it for a long time and provided that they do it the right way. It takes time to learn a language, but surprisingly, if you do it regularly, 2 years is enough to get a solid understanding of the language, and in some cases even speak it decently.
You're listening to the Information Theory Podcast. My guest today is Luca Lampariello, a language coach and hyper polyglot from Rome, who speaks 10 languages fluently and has studied 15 languages in total. In this episode, we talk about what it actually takes to learn a new language as an adult, why most people fail, and whether it's really possible to sound like a native if you start learning after childhood. My first question, take me back to your early childhood in Rome, before you ever set foot in an English classroom. What was your home environment like? Were there books everywhere? What kind of role did your parents play in your education?
It was a monolingual household in the sense that we all just spoke Italian, my parents and I, my siblings, my sister and my brother. But I have to tell you that, the most important thing was the fact that my parents, especially my grandmother, instilled the seed of curiosity in me. So my grandmother was very curious about everything, my father as well, my parents. And so I kind of breathed this atmosphere where there was this intellectual curiosity, and they pushed me towards understanding more about the world, understanding more about myself. In particular, I remember that we spent, for example, every summer, and we had a summer house, and my grandmother, I have this vivid memory of my grandmother sitting at this veranda, and she had a couple of books in her lap, and she said, "Hey, come here, I'm just going to show you something." And she had the book was a Latin grammar book, and it was like French and mathematics. So at the right page of I think 9 or 10, instead of playing with other children on the beach on a very sunny summer day, I was just hitting the book, so to speak, with my grandmother. And what inspired me was the fact that she was already 89 or 90, so she was already old, and she had this thirst for knowledge. So for her, learning was a pleasure. So she was sitting there and she wanted to teach me, and by teaching, because the teachers are also learners, she kind of inspired me subconsciously. I realized this is what I want to do. This is this is what drives me, what compels me. It's learning for the pleasure of learning.
So you were not exposed directly to foreign languages, or you didn't try to learn any foreign languages until you were like 9 or 10. But up till that point, do you feel like you were unusually precocious, advanced in your Italian class, had a big vocabulary or something like that?
The answer might surprise me, but I was actually pretty poor at it. Italian was one of the worst, I mean, my native language. I remember that I wrote a dissertation. Now, my first dissertation when I was in middle school, I was 10, and the Italian teacher called my parents and said, "Oh, your child is having huge problems with writing in Italian." So actually, I was not good at Italian either. So that kind of defies the fact that I was precocious and I was ready, a kind of language genius. Nothing of the sort. I actually had a lot of problems with Italian first, and then with English and French later. People never talk about this, but in order to learn a second language, if your first language is strong, you have a head start, you have an advantage. And then what happened when I was, again, 10, and my Italian teacher, still remember to this day, for more than 30 years have gone by, I still remember very vividly when my Italian teacher said, "You're not good enough, you have to improve." And then I was asking myself, how can I improve? And it all happened naturally because at around 10, I started reading books. And in particular, I started reading Choose Your Adventure books. The series was The Lone Wolf. I read it in Italian. It's called Lupo Solitario in Italian. And I started devouring every single book. And then I started buying other series, and I started reading massively. And then, amazingly, after 2 or 3 months, my written Italian skyrocketed, got so much better. And the Italian teacher was really surprised. And that habit of reading massively stayed with me for the rest of my life. Just to answer your question, I was not particularly good with languages, not even with my own native language.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what that points to is, I don't know if you can call it environment, but just the fact that you were so obsessed with these books, right? That's kind of a part of your personality. And you could have a parent who tries to force this on a child, like, go read 2 hours a day, but there's nothing that really can compare with just being intrinsically motivated to just sit down with these choose your own adventure books and devour them at a young age.
That's exactly right. When it comes to reading, when it comes to drawing, when it comes to learning languages, learning mathematics, I think one of the most important factors is whether you enjoy it or not. If you don't enjoy something, you're not bound to do this over the long term. And that is what really makes a difference between someone who managed to learn a language and someone who hasn't or won't. Because ultimately, when people ask me, why do you learn so many languages? It's just because it's fun. I think in part was my family, that
Mhm.
give me a kick. It was just like a little push. And then I just kind of like doing this stuff. I also saw my siblings who were not that interested in learning English or reading, while I was almost obsessed by it. I was spent countless hours reading and learning language, and I've been doing it over the last 35 years. So I think it's not so much as a talent. I think it's just a compound effect. If you do something for a long period of time and you do it well and figure out a way to do it and you have fun on top of that, bingo.
So you started learning English and French in school at age 10. What do you remember about those early years? You already said that even Italian didn't come naturally to you, right? So how did learning English and French go for you?
Well, suffices to say that I used to pronounce enough like now. So you can imagine I had been mainly reading English instead of listening to it. So I hadn't acquired anything. The reality is, was not good at all. So my first American tutor, private tutor, who started talking to me, started working with me, she could barely understand what I wanted to say. And what happened is that in a matter of like, I think maybe a couple of months, my English was completely transformed because not only did I start speaking with her, but also I started watching movies. So I moved from a school environment where all I did was reading stuff without even listening to the language to constantly watching movies with subtitles. So I remember that she recorded movies for me. And on top of that, I could also buy movies with the entire transcript and subtitles. It's called Speak Up. So it was a Speak Up series. I started devouring all the movies I could get my hands on. So I just started watching maybe a couple of movies every week. Not just watching them, I was watching them and reading the transcript, and I was marking the words and the expressions that I found interesting, and I was writing them, jotting them down into some notebook, and I was reciting the lines of the actors. I think what really made a difference is I really wanted to be like an American, sound like an American, act like an American. It was just like it was a complete organic global experience where English was really transforming my life. And I think in part that is also the reason why I really wanted to speak like an American. It's just like learning the language in and of itself. And so that really changed things because primarily we acquire language by listening to it, not by reading it. But of course, reading was conducive to understanding what I was watching and I was listening to. Actually, what I was watching, I was not listening to podcasts because, as you can imagine, 30 years ago, podcast was not a thing, right? So
Yeah.
I was mainly watching a lot of movies. And then it turns out I just like spent hundreds of hours watching, especially American movies, maybe a couple of British movies here and there, but overwhelmingly American movies. And then on top of that, I was also working with Susan by writing short text dissertations. I was getting a lot of feedback on my. I recently founded. I found the stuff where she wrote all the corrections, and then she was correcting my pronunciation. We had, I think, a couple of hours every week. She came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I was like having a couple of hours of conversation. She was wonderful. She was a wonderful teacher, and she was pushing me to do better and better every day. Well, can imagine that the combination of hundreds of books, hundreds of movies, and conversation with Susan at the time was the only native speaker I was really talking to face, well, that kind of brought about a major change in the way I spoke, and the way I understood English, the way I was using it. And ultimately it became a part of me. It's not just like another language to your adding a language to your repertoire. It was really a way, a means of expressing myself. And again, I was dreaming of going to the United States, of sounding American, being an American, of blending in and all these things.
That's really interesting that you were really motivated by this psychological mindset of wanting to become an American. And maybe that says a lot about the power of America's cultural influence, like the soft power of Hollywood.
Absolutely, 100%.
And so you had this amazing transformation from someone who was maybe mediocre at school English, and then all of a sudden, within a few months, you became head and shoulders above your peers. I mean, people must have been suspicious, like, what's going on here? How did your classmates react to that?
Um, I gotta tell you the truth, they were not very happy about it because I started sounding different from them. So I started sounding like I do now. And to Italian ears, this is very strange because an Italian learning English would sound like this. So, for example, if I speak Italian like this, it might sound like a stereotype, but I'm speaking from the front of my mouth. So I have front vowels that are very open, while in English you tend to sound, this is called voice placement. You can tell that my English or the way I speak English sounds much more nasal because I'm using much more the soft palate. Ma in italiano sono molto più, while in Italian it sounds different because I use more like the front part of my mouth. The mouth is a very complex organ. It's a resonator. And for example, if I speak like this, you can tell that I'm sounding more nasal. This is because I'm using the soft palate. So, but the bottom line is that when I started sounding like more like an American and less like an Italian, people saw that almost as a threat, meaning that they were not happy about it. So they were like imitating my like nyeh. They were like doing this sound nyeh nyeh nyeh. It's like, oh, this guy is sounding strange. But I didn't care, honestly. But the reality is, they were not that interested in learning English. Nobody cared. Nobody had ever told us why you're learning English. It was just like there. Oh, it's part of the curriculum. You have to learn English and another foreign language. So we did it because we had to do it, not because we wanted to do it. And that's a big difference. I think 95% of the people that were doing it because they had to do it, because nobody had instilled the pleasure of learning. When you have a great teacher, it sets the example. They don't even teach you, just they instill the power and instill the desire of learning. Because at the end of the day, nobody can teach you a language. You have to learn it by yourself. The fact that I learned so many languages mainly depends on my mindset, time on task, of course, and on using techniques that are brain friendly, leveraging the sound principles of language acquisition. And I've learned all these things by experimenting. I've messed up multiple times. I've tried multiple times. Some things work, some things did not work. And then I found the set of ensemble of strategies that work for me. And I've been applying them and refining them ever since to learn and maintain a bunch of languages.
Mm-hmm. You've coached hundreds of people in terms of learning foreign languages. Is your position that anyone can learn a foreign language to fluency within a reasonable amount of time? Um, is that your position, or are there people who just can't do it?
There are people who cannot do it, and in that case, they have some physical impairment, unfortunately. But if you can speak your own native language well, then you have everything in terms of, your brain capacity, and also the entire phonatory system. So phonatory system, I mean your mouth, lungs, etc. You can learn any language at any age. It gets more difficult, of course, if you try to learn a language at 80 if you've never done it. But human brains are wired and equipped to learn any foreign language, provided that they do it for a long time and provided that they do it the right way. Those who do not learn foreign languages are not because they're not gifted or because they can't. It's just because they lack, the mindset or the self-management and or the correct learning strategies. People do not know how to self-manage. Oh, if you're not motivated enough, then you can't learn. But there's a big misunderstanding about that, because I'm pretty sure that it just happened to you that you don't feel like doing something, and then all of a sudden you start doing something and you get into the groove of it, and you tell yourself, wait a second, I've been doing this for 30 minutes or like an hour. So you just start it, right? So all you need to do is to design a system and an environment that are conducive to learning. Let me give you an even more concrete example of that. Let's suppose that you started learning Japanese by yourself, right? So if every day you have your desktop, you have language learning material which is waiting there, and you already know exactly which podcast you're going to use, how you're going to use it, and you already experimented with the timing, so you know that it's going to take more or less 45 minutes. That's way easier to start. And on top of that, you anchor the habit of sitting down and learning Japanese with, say, you grab a cup of coffee. It's called anchoring, right? Cup of coffee, Japanese. Then you're bound to do that day in and day out. It takes time to learn a language. It takes a couple of years. Think about a child after 4, 5, 6 years of 24/7 constantly being exposed to the language, observing how their parents speak. So round the clock, literally. As adults, we don't have that luxury, maybe an hour a day. So you can imagine it takes much more time. That's the reason why doing it regularly does count. But surprisingly, if you do it regularly, 2 years is enough to get a solid understanding of the language, and in some cases, even speak it decently.
So 2 years, so those videos online that say learn Italian in 3 months, that's not going to cut it?
Well, there's some obsession about speed because once again we live in a world where clickbaity titles generate money. The problem is that it's very ambiguous because first of all you have to define what it means to learn a language. The concept of learning a language, quote unquote, or fluency, they're prone to a lot of interpretation.
What is your threshold for fluency? If you even use that word, what does it mean for you when you say somebody's fluent or somebody knows a language?
I would like to use this word sparingly, but unfortunately I don't because
Is there a better way to describe a certain level of competence that you think is a relevant milestone?
I would say that fluency is not an easy term to define, but I would say that you speak a language fluently when you're able to express yourself freely, albeit with mistakes, and you're able to understand most of what the other person says. So, as we're doing right now, I think I speak English fluently. And it's also a degree of confidence you have when you speak a foreign language. So there's two parts. The psychological part is about how comfortable you feel when you talk, when you speak this language, and then linguistically, it's the capacity of understanding the language well and being able to express yourself well, which does not mean that you express yourself perfectly, but meaning that even native speakers make mistakes.
We've been talking about these kind of like general language learning principles. Let's make it very concrete. Let's say you have an American who just moved to Italy. They were transferred there by their company and they need to become conversational or fluent or competent in the language as soon as possible. They have no background in the Italian language. Let's say they had maybe 3 hours a day to devote to this. Could you sketch out just concretely what you would do if you were coaching this person to become conversationally fluent in Italian in as little time as possible? Maybe not 3 months, but the sooner the better.
If you're asking me specifically about the situation of an American coming to Italy, when they have English and Italian, they're not so distant. I like thinking in terms of distance rather than difficulty. So Italian is not a language that is particularly different from English because you have a lot of cognates, you got a lot of words coming from Latin. I dare say 40 to 50% of the words are, they're very similar. There's false friends, but that's not a problem. So you already have an advantage in that regard. And when it comes to also learning the language, it really depends on the individual as well. Is that a person who's ever learned a foreign language? If they've never learned a foreign language, then 3 months, once again, is just you're dipping your toe in the language. But if you have 3 hours, the very first thing I would say is that I think you should have from the get-go maybe 2 hours of intensive input and maybe 1 hour of activation. What do I mean by that? I would have them listen and read. Once again, start with dialogues very intensively to a lot of stuff in the form of dialogues. Why in the form of dialogues? Because dialogues are like, human beings have been learning languages with dialogues and stories since the dawn of time. You build a first set of dialogues and then you spend 2 hours. In that amount of time, 2 hours, they're going to go through these dialogues. So of course, the dialogues are going to be in Italian and in English so that he's comprehensible content, highly personalized about his own situation. And then he's going to start listening and reading for 2 hours. Then he can hop, for example, if he has a teacher, the teacher, maybe from the second week, once he's gotten a little bit of input, can go through certain words and start forming very short sentences with some of the words that he's been learning through these dialogues. If you spend 2 or 3 hours doing that every day, an American would quickly move from very simple dialogues to very simple stories produced by AI, for example, and then you can use podcasts created with AI or with podcasts created for language learners of Italian. There's a lot of them. And then they can keep building the stuff with podcasts that are perfectly within the Goldilocks zone of learners at that level, plus some videos. You have hundreds of videos on YouTube, 5 minute, 5 or 6 minutes, catered to language learners. Like one common mistake is to jump into, I want to watch movies. Gonna watch movies in Italian, even if I'm a beginner. It's just a waste of time. It's too difficult. You have to build your skills good enough so that you can move on to the next stage. And then once again, if you have a teacher and you live in Italy, It's got to go much faster because you can speak with the teacher, and then slowly you can start using the language when you're ordering something, you're at the restaurant, etc. Just to answer your question, like how fast a person can learn a language really depends on the intensity and the regularity. The ideal situation would be the whole day, 8 hours a day. So theoretically, an adult can learn a language extremely fast, but in practice, very few people can pull it off for reasons that do not belong to the realm of neuroscience. They're more like the limited amount of time and energy we have when it comes to acquiring a language or any other skill.
Yeah, so in terms of specific tactics, you talked a lot about acquisition rich input like podcasts and kind of these dialogues that you generate using AI. It's interesting you didn't talk about studying grammar or memorizing vocabulary through flashcards, or more of these kind of like deliberate study techniques. What is your view on those? And like, do they have any place in this intensive regimen that you're envisioning for this, American who's trying to learn Italian?
They do, but they kind of occupies a small place, so to speak. If you want to acquire a language effectively in a brain-friendly way, input should be at the bottom of the pyramid. The proportion is always input should be 70% of your time, output maybe 20%, and those drills 10%. So the grammar explanations are there for you to understand the language, facilitate comprehension. So if you spend too much time reading grammar stuff, you're reading about the language, you're not using or understanding the language itself. So you learn grammar from language in the sense that if you, instead of reading a grammar book, you consume content and you have some grammar explanations that facilitate the acquisition and the comprehension of that content, then that's how you start understanding the grammar better and better. You know the grammar of your own native language intuitively because you have internalized it through 6 years of exposure and use, right?
I wonder, so there's this thing in linguistics called the critical period hypothesis, and it's the idea that there's a window in childhood after which acquiring a language to native-like proficiency becomes fundamentally harder or maybe even impossible. And so obviously, as someone who's personally acquired a bunch of languages as an adult, you don't quite believe that. But, do you think there's anything to it? I mean, do you think acquiring languages has become harder as you've gotten older? There's something about the biology of aging beyond the age of, say, 13 that makes things fundamentally harder. And then a related question is, I think people believe that this applies especially to pronunciation. How do you feel about this like idea of the critical period, and how do you feel about acquiring like pronunciation?
We're opening a can of worms here. There's so much to say. First of all, there's a lot of people that fundamentally think that second language acquisition is fundamentally different from language acquisition. But in fact, I strongly believe, and I've found more and more researchers talking about this, that actually second language acquisition is very, very similar to first language acquisition. To my knowledge and to my experience, I've met individuals who speak a second language extremely well. So the majority of people do not reach that level, especially if they learn a language in their 20s, 30s, 40s, etc. But I do know a handful of people who are able to pass, they're so good in terms of pronunciation and language skills and competence and cultural understanding that it shows that it's possible. Now, most of the people I met who have reached extremely high levels in a foreign language or in multiple languages for that matter. Normally, they tend to live in that country, or they tend to have a partner that who speaks their target language, or they spent a significant amount of time in a country but then traveling a lot. So they have also a cultural understanding because they've come into contact with the culture itself, not just through movies and media, but just like really living the language with native speakers. So that would be, for example, my case in French. I lived in France for 3 years. I had a girlfriend for 5. I went to a French school. All that when I was like past 30. And when I got to know my ex-girlfriend, I had, I wouldn't go so far as to say a thick accent in French. But when I listened to myself and I watched the first video that I recorded on the Charles Bridge in Prague, when I got to know my ex-girlfriend, I had an accent and quite a big one in French. So I said, wow, that's me. But then speaking with her constantly on the phone, we spoke like 2 hours on the phone because she was living in Paris and I was living in Italy. And then spending time, I went there, etc. In a matter of months, my accent turned from have kind of a thick accent, not necessarily Italian, but thick foreign accent, to speaking. People can't tell that I'm Italian. They think I'm French. So, and I did all that when I was 27. Spanish is the same thing. Most people think I'm from Spain. They can't tell. And I started learning when I was 19. So it's quite
Mm.
possible. And I'm not the only one. I've met people who speak multiple languages. Now, once again, I'm not saying that I speak exactly like a native, but that most of the time, especially for when it comes to French and in Spanish, and also in English, a lot of Americans ask me, "Are you from the United States?" Then, if you hear me speak for a longer period of time, you can tell there's takeaways. There's like, okay, well, the guy is not from the United States. I've I've never really lived there, so I don't understand cultural references, and you can tell. But I've learned the language at a, I think I express myself well. That's the most important thing.
Oh yeah. I mean, yeah. So I mean, you're living proof that it's possible to get to native like levels of uh, accent fluency in all these different languages, even in your late 20s, early 30s.
Yes.
So obviously you're an outlier, right? Because there are people who are like, let's say someone immigrates to the US, they become incredibly articulate in English, but their accent still marks them as foreign, and it's just very, very obvious. First of all, why is that? And conversely, what do you think it is about you that you were so good at picking up these accents or deliberately practicing them? How do you train people who come to you and say, I've been speaking English for 20 years, I want to get rid of my thick foreign accent?
If you think about it, human beings are very tribal. When we hear about religion, politics, people like at our each other's throats on social media because we're tribal. Like we pick a side and then we defend our position, etc., etc. Human beings are tribal also in a linguistic sense, in the sense that when you learn your own native language, sounding when you start speaking a second language, what happens is there's two things at play. One is the objective problem that we have or difficulty because once we are born, normally after a year, the child starts hearing the language from the womb. And what happens is that they pick up, it's called sound inventory of their native language, so the amount of sounds that are specific to their own native language. And then that kind of locks in the sound inventory. The brain learns the stuff and kicks out or has a hard time distinguishing anything that does not belong to that sound inventory.
So this is the Japanese people can't distinguish.
L from R. That's an example. A glaring example of that is the all L and R. The Japanese children can't distinguish that after a year. They already can't. So objectively, it's difficult because the brain can't pick them up. But that doesn't mean that you cannot train it. You can train everything. But I think the most important, the major factor is psychological. Going back to the tribe stuff,
Sorry, before you get into that, I am curious. You've learned so many languages. What is like the equivalent for you of the L and the R, like the most difficult sounds that you had to consciously train because of your monolingual upbringing?
it's the ch in Russian. So basically, I just realized that I pronounced it wrong. That was back in, I don't remember, it was like maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when I really wanted to get good in Russian. And I realized that I mispronounced certain things, but in particular is this ch. Sometimes we tend to think that, oh, that's in Italian, right? Ch. But no, it's in Russian, it's a different ch, which is very difficult to distinguish. So difficult, in fact, that even Russian children have to be sometimes trained to produce the sound correctly because it's not ch, it's ch. Still, I think I still have a hard time with that and a few other sounds in Russian. But if you train your brain and you have some feedback and a teacher points out certain things, you can kind of close the gap. In my case, I think 90% is psychology and my will, once again, of sounding like a native, and that 20% I closed the gap just by trying things, getting feedback. Having a knack for accents, meaning that I have since I was a little child, a tendency of imitating anything and everything.
Mm.
So sounds, politicians, my friends, actors, and also I kept reciting lines, imitating actors, exactly what they said, how they said it, the tone, the rhythm, the voice, the pronunciation, and that effort pays off. It was fun for me. I was not thinking, hey, I'm doing this because one day I'll hit the United States and everybody's got to be flabbergasted by the fact I speak American English like this, just like that. But I do remember, though, that the breakthrough moment was when, for the first time, I went abroad and I went for 3 weeks. My parents sent me and my twin sister to Ireland. July 1996, I was 15. And I remember that after 2 or 3, like, someone was asking, why do you speak English so well? And then a guy just walked, I still remember this, a guy, he was like 13, 14 maybe, on a bicycle. He's an American.
Once you saw the results with English, did you immediately think to yourself like, I can do this with any other language, and then you were off to the races and learning like, French, German, Spanish?
Oh, no, no, no. When I started learning English, I was 10, and I was in middle school, and the same thing happened with French. And then I started enjoying both languages. So in French, something similar happened. I started watching a lot of movies, and I started greatly enjoying it outside of the classroom, which was the reason why I was so successful, is just because I was doing things outside of the class. And at the ripe age of 15, I decided to go for German because I had seen an ad on TV and I said, "Oh, this course looks interesting." They were advertising a specific course, which is called Il Plan di Agostini, which was like made of small installments with dialogues, and then the advanced level was movies, etc. And I started doing that. I didn't know what to do exactly, but I started experimenting because I think experimenting is one of the most powerful ways of treat life as an experiment. Like you're a scientist and life is your playground. So that's what happened. I started experimenting. I say, okay, what if I translate, what if I listen and read, but I also write all the text in Italian. I translate from German into Italian, and then 2 days later I try to translate it back. And I said, I like this method. So I started doing it every day for 2 hours a day. And then 1 year later, I started doing the same thing for Spanish. Then I met a Dutch girl in Sardinia, and I said, "Oh, she didn't speak English that well. Why not learn, Dutch?" And so I started learning Dutch, which was way easier than German. It's a Germanic language, very similar. So if you already know Dutch, it's easy, relatively easy, straightforward. And
If you
then
already know English.
yeah, if you know, like if you know English, but also if you know German. I knew German at the time. That really helped. Dutch is a simplified. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that. The Dutch would get angry. It's a simplified
It's
version
okay.
of.
This is a safe space. You can say whatever you want
Yeah,
about
yeah, but I
Dutch.
but I mean it's like it's simpler than German. Let's put it this way. And then for different reasons I started learning one language after the other. I always say that languages are like it's languages that choose me, not the other way around. Like for whatever reason in my life, something happens and then I'm enticed to learn. And then I learned Swedish and then Russian and then Portuguese and then Mandarin Chinese. And there's another pivotal moment where I made a YouTube video, that YouTube video we're referring to, that became viral where I speak 8 languages. I did it on a whim, or really, like I was there in Spain. I told myself I had watched a couple of people making multilingual videos.
In that video, so you spoke 8 languages in in that video. I think Russian was actually your weakest, right? Like at the
Yeah.
time that you were recording it. Why was Russian particularly difficult for you, despite having acquired all these other languages? And then how did you eventually end up mastering it?
Well, one of the things that normally people think about learning a language is like the more languages you have under your belt, the easier it becomes. But yes and no, because I would say that on the one hand, you're more confident once you've learned one language, and you know for a fact that you can probably learn another language. Now, the other problem is that languages come in families, right? For example, Italian, Spanish, French all belong to the same language family. They're pretty similar. By the time I started tackling Russian, I had learned Romance languages and Germanic languages, basically. So that was the first time I was learning a language outside of these families. It was a Slavic language. In fact, Slavic languages are notorious for being difficult because in Russian, you have, depending on the case and the function, you change the ending, but you can also change sometimes the entire root, not to mention also the verbs, which makes it really complicated. But once again, it all comes down to the same principles. If you spend enough time learning the language in the right way, then the language is gonna you're gonna you're gonna end up learning the language. Plus the same thing happened with Russian. I wanted to sound like a Russian. I wanted to be a Russian. I wanted to express myself like a Russian. And when I got to know my ex-girlfriend, Russian girlfriend, then that's
I'm
where,
sensing a theme here.
yeah, there's a thing, but it helps. Yeah, it helps. Like in the languages I speak the best, like for example French or German or Spanish or Russian or Polish recently, it really makes a difference because you use the language on an everyday basis. So it has made a difference in my case. Also, you go to the country, you meet the parents, you meet the friends, and you start using the language at a different level. Consuming the content is great, but when you start using the language with the native speakers, across a wide variety of situations. And in the environment, that's where it takes your language learning to a completely new level.
We've talked a lot about your successes at learning all these different languages, but you've also talked in the past about how you've had failures in language learning. Of all the languages that you've taken on, what was your biggest failure?
I would say Japanese, because it's a language to try to learn, failed because this was an SOV language, subject, object, verbs, a completely different structure. I didn't approach it the right way, didn't use the right material. I was maybe not even that convinced that I wanted to learn Japanese, and I just dropped it. But I wouldn't consider it a failure in the sense that I see it like maybe it was an attempt at courting this girl, this one girl, and she rejected me. But now I'm going back with a vengeance. In fact, I'd like to go back to learning Japanese in 2026 because I know I know now which. So back in the day, I did not have very good translation tools. I did not have the right material. It was really difficult. Nowadays, I can do exactly what I'm doing with Turkish. First of all, I've been learning Turkish, which is an SOV language, started speaking it. And then nowadays we live in an era where I can create my own content. I can create 100 podcasts about things I'm extremely interested in, create a transcript, and I can have the transcript with furigana, so I can see the Japanese characters, how they're pronounced. And on top of that, I can create the audio. I have so much stuff that I can consume, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. And I'm a false beginner because I did speak it back in the day. I learned the language for 2 years, and I was having conversations, but they were very hard. They were very difficult because I was constantly thinking of the words and arranging them together because I hadn't done enough of listening and reading. I hadn't gotten the language with me. So you make certain attempts. Sometimes you learn faster. Sometimes you have to go back and circle back and try new things. But it's all valuable.
Mhm.
Everything is valuable.
So you'll go back to it, go back to Japanese.
I will probably in January 2026, and I will love to go to Japan. On top of that, that would be like crowning the dream. Which by the way, the fact that I want to go to Japan in September 2026 or October is going to be a huge motivating factor because, hey, I'm going to hit Japan in a few months. I better be prepared to talk to that taxi driver, So that's exactly what I'm going to do.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, my penultimate question. So do you know Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentine writer?
Yes, he's a very famous writer.
There's a interview of him online where he actually says he prefers the English language to his native Spanish because it's more expressive in his opinion. You have like these different registers of Germanic versus Latin words. It's interesting that he would actually say like, I prefer one language to another, and it's not even his native language. So do you have any languages that you are particularly attached to that you feel like are superior in some way to the others? If not, is there a language that you would say, like out of the ones that you've learned, is the most underrated language?
I would say, well, Borges, it's interesting what Borges said about Spanish and English. I find English, every language as its beauty, as its quirks. When I speak English, for example, I'm very direct when I use English to plan. To me, English is about functionality, and Italian is more about beauty. Italian, French, or Spanish. So I would have a different opinion than Borges. But there are languages, I like all languages to tell you the truth, but there are some languages I like more than others. For example, Greek, German, and Russian are my three favorite languages. Greek being on top. And the reason why is that Greek is, to me, because this is subjective, sounds great. It sounds beautiful. It has kind of the complexity of Russian for in certain aspects. So it's complex and beautiful at the same time. It has the beauty of Spanish, sounds like Spanish, but it's not Spanish. But it has the complexity, grammatical complexity of Russian and the cultural, and it's very similar to Italy. I think Greeks are extremely similar to Italians. Well, it's no coincidence because Greeks conquered southern Italy, and southern Italy, they would just use the way we use the language, the way we use our gestures, the cultural references, what we say, how do we react is so similar, it's scary. And that's the reason why Greek is my favorite language. German and Russian because they're complex and elegant. It's rigorous. Like German is logic. It's a beautiful language. It's complex. I like complexity and elegance at the same time embedded in a language. And on these three have all those features in and more. So that's why I like them. But at the end of the day, I like every language I've learned. I like it. It's just like a family member that joins the family. You love them all, you know. But there are some languages I really really like because they.
You love them all, but you like some of them more than
Yeah,
others.
that's exactly right. Exactly.
My last question, Luca, you wake up tomorrow and you have to choose. Either you forget every language you know except for Italian and English, or you keep everything, but you can never learn a new language again. Which one do you choose?
I will keep everything, and I will never be able to learn a language again because I already speak 15 languages, so I can live with that. You know? So I would very much prefer staying with, okay, can't learn another language, I can live with that, but not only, but I would, to me, losing 13 languages would be a big deal. So I definitely would stay with that, just like 15 languages, can't learn another language, not the end of the world. I can live with that.
Great. That's a great answer. All right. Thank you, Luca. It was a pleasure talking with you, and thanks for sharing all that you know with us today.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you very much for inviting me.
All right.
Ciao, ciao.